This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Welcome to the Jali podcast. I'm your host, Melyssa Barrett. This podcast is for those who are interested in the conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Each week, I'll be interviewing a guest who has something special to share or is actively part of building solutions in the space. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. It's Melyssa Barrett here. I figured since everyone is talking about artificial intelligence and how it is being incorporated into all sorts of things with Chat GPT and everything else, that it might be kind of fun to repost an episode that I did really early on in, I think it was 2020. Scott Edington, who is the CEO of Deep Labs. And I just thought it might be interesting to go back and hear some of what we were talking about when it comes to artificial intelligence. Scott is the CEO of Deep Labs, and his career spans 2 decades of creating next generation technology in the payments, defense, and intelligence sectors. I got to know Scott. We both worked at Visa for a period of time, and he was global head of research and development at Visa and really founded the Visa Labs. So now they have, an innovation center and all of those things, but he was in the groundbreaking states of shifting Visa in many ways when he was there. So he began his career at Booz Allen Hamilton. He's been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and George Mason University. And he's a guest lecturer. He holds degrees from the University of Virginia and Johns Hopkins. I should obviously be calling him Dr. Scott Edington. But he has many industry certifications in security, strategy, and network computing. He is all around persona-based artificial intelligence at Deep Labs. And they use that persona-based artificial intelligence to enable businesses to solve complex problems. And they're continuously assessing risk in real time. That was something we knew very well working at Visa, because that's the way you end up being able to reduce fraud, identity theft, optimize your customer experience, and make better business decisions and therefore more revenue. So with that, I will let you hear an excerpt from episode 7 of the Jali podcast. Check it out. Dr. Edington, thank you so much for joining me for this wonderful conversation. I am ecstatic to talk to you about all of the things that you have accomplished with respect to now you being the CEO and co-founder of Deep Labs. And maybe we could just start there and you can talk about, what is Deep Labs?
Sure. Well, number one, thanks for taking the time to spend with me this afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity. So Deep Labs, in a 30-second overview, moving to you, it's a company that's pretty much focused entirely on context-aware artificial intelligence capabilities. And so what that means for the non-geek out there effectively is, think of a world where computer systems really fully appreciate what persona you might be exhibiting at any given moment in time. So the easy example I always use is Scott Edington sitting in Oakland, California, pre-pandemic is a little different than Scott Edington having sheltered in place for 2.5 to 3 months in Oakland, California. Yes, from an identity perspective, it's still Scott, but obviously the context and everything around all of us has shifted. And because of that, having systems that are intelligent enough to understand that, yes, still Scott, but the personas that Scout will now exhibit will be dramatically different or would have shifted based on context, based on surroundings, based on, everything that's happening in 2020.
Yeah, that's interesting that you call them personas because as in the world of diversity and inclusion, and of course, I've worked in the area of identity, it's all about your identity. And it's almost like we have multiple identities all over the place, whether you're at work or at home or, what your shopping looks like or any of that kind of stuff. So those personas, I'm assuming, can really engage a person in different ways depending on what they're trying to do.
No, I think you nailed it, Melyssa. Obviously, given your background, you fully appreciate all the interesting things that have happened in the industry in the last 10, 20, now 30 years of our respective careers. And the reality is that, circa 2005, 2010, simply using sort of static attributes like mom's maiden name or social security number, that was fine, frankly. And that's how much the system sort of keyed off of understanding, is it really Scott or is it not, right? But as we all know, unfortunately, due to some well-known data breaches and other things that have occurred now in the world, those static signals are frankly very much antiquated or, in my vernacular, decayed. And they've decayed because everyone has access to them now. I mean, you can Google where I went to high school, you can Google where I was born, like it's freely available and most times pretty accurate. And if things you can't Google, you can certainly find on the dark web for next to nothing. And so because of that, as we built in those practitioners, there were a number of point solution providers that came up specifically focused around things like address verification or device signals and device intelligence, which again, were absolutely fantastic as a sort of a way to sort of patch the holes. But unfortunately, like anything else, the advanced persistent threats that exist out there, whether it be from nation state actors, whether it be from folks who are individuals trying to do nefarious things, these signals have also decayed. And so what we've really been focused on is figuring out a mechanism and capabilities now we have to effectively create a full context-rich understanding of about an actor. And an actor for us, by the way, could be an organization, it could be a consumer, it could be a human being, it could be a bot. But the idea is effectively we want to be able to understand at multi-layers which signals should be used to identify what context that actor should be in, and then understand exactly what persona we'd expect that actor to exhibit at this moment in time versus what the reality is. And then effectively figure out a mechanism to see whether or not is that really who we expect Scott Edington's persona to be right now versus, we've actually seen this persona before. And last time we saw it was associated with a bad act. I know they presented all the correct credentials, but decline. Or, it's a little different than we might expect from Scott at this moment, but he's in Washington, D.C. today as opposed to in California. Therefore, let's not introduce friction to this consumer experience. Let's go ahead and approve that transaction. And so it does work both ways, either from a propensity standpoint or an authorization standpoint, all the way to the opposite spectrum, which is advanced risk capabilities.
One of the things that I hear a lot about is just in terms of people of color and, I spent a lot of time, obviously, on financial education. And so there is this whole segment about financial inclusion. And essentially, there are many people, specifically of color, who are not part of the financial system. But I think all economies think that they should be working or at least have a strategic plan to address financial inclusion. So can you talk a little bit about how artificial intelligence and where we're going impacts people that are not, maybe they don't have a bank account or they aren't, maybe they're using a check cashing or, doing some alternative financing. How does that impact some of the stuff that you're doing with artificial intelligence and all of those discussions we're having on privacy and other things?
Well, number one, thanks for the question. It's a topic that I'm, as you know, very passionate about, specifically the underbanked population. So whether it be here in the U.S. or certainly globally, the numbers are very clear. They disproportionately affect people of color. So, I would say, first and foremost, I think the key thing is understanding. Again, going back to my college days, what are the influences to why that's happening? So that could be both macro and micro. I think there are some obviously systematic reasons for some of the underbanked reasons, but I also think from a techie perspective for a second, if you sort of take a step back and look at how typical systems, bank systems or financial services systems work, in terms of how they onboard new customers or clients, how they make credit underwriting decisions, how they verify things like income or verify addresses. These are all sort of things that, frankly, you and I sort of take for granted, given where we are. But these are real things that are hurdles and introduce friction, even for something simply as I want to start a bank account for my 8-year-old, or I want to start a college fund, or I just want to have a checking account so I can write checks, or God forbid write checks now, but as sort of space in the digital economy. And so, when I would say, going back to my earlier statement around signals and noise, the ability to not always focus on all sort of the antiquated signals of yesteryear, mom's maiden name, what high school did you go to, some of the old sort of static signals, but more focused on the near or sort of the recent signals that now exist based off of where we are and normally where we would be in 2020 and hopefully now in 2021. And I stress that only because whether we, again, talk about digital onboarding remotely, because now I guess everyone really doesn't want to go into a branch, but how do you actually identify that is in fact Scott without having a social security card? Again, I'm dating myself, social security card or a passport. How do you do that remotely? How do you do that securely? How do you do that in a frictionless environment that's not overly invasive, number one, but still has a confidence level that's higher enough that says that actually meets the guidelines necessary for a risk-based system. And so, a long answer to your very short question, the reality is that for the underbanked populations, keying off of things that are static signals of yesteryear is actually a method of disenfranchisement. It is. And so if we're able to use the modern signals, if we're able to use the context that we talked before around personas, then in fact you can start providing banking services and banking capabilities to folks who ordinarily wouldn't necessarily have a generic checking account. So if you're talking about, let's say, the prepaid market as an example, because as we both know, that's something the underbanked population does leverage. How do you actually still enable them to be onboarded and still meet the demands of like the Patriot Act, as you know? That sometimes is difficult for some people from a hurdle perspective, right? So again, is it simply keying off of static signals, or can you actually start replace some of those static signals with dynamic signals that we now enjoy? And the answer overwhelmingly is yes.
Let's pause for a moment. We'll be right back. Well, and it's interesting because it seems like the more signals we get, the more models are built that provide, things like credit scoring and fraud scoring capabilities. And if the underbanked population has a lack of information in those models, then it can create other challenges for whatever the objective is, which, to your point, hopefully is less systemic in terms of, kind of hurdles around systemic racism and stuff like that in the past, because at least it's using information in an objective manner. But if the data is not there, then I guess you have other issues. So how do you account for things like signals that aren't really there?
Mm-hmm. Now to answer two parts, I think first thing is, let's just fully recognize how the old systems work, right? And what they over-index for, which is, given your background, firsthand, they're over-indexed for things that tend to represent certain populations, not others, right? So if you just look at it from just a pure data science modeling perspective, what does the sample look like, right? And figuring out what should the sample be in 2020 versus maybe what it was in 1985 or 1990. A lot of these systems were first sort of theorized, right? And so if you sort of eliminate dare I say, the lack of proper sampling, you actually fix that. That's step one. Step two is if you now have a proper sample or a fully representative sample, then you can start looking at other methods and other attributes and characteristics that could represent the gap that you just mentioned, right? So again, as opposed to keying off of where you went to make this up, where you went to high school, the fact that you've had a job for the last two years at the same place. Frankly, I'd rather know that
than where you went to high school.
Yeah, where I was high school, back in the early 90s, right? So, and I sort of say it somewhat flippantly, but it's actually true. Again, if you really just think about the context surrounding each individual, human beings are remarkably great at picking up on things, right? When someone's a little bit off that day, right? Or something, your gut says something's not quite right. Up until now, those models, they didn't really take into account instinct or gut. They listen to hard and fast numbers. This is what we've always done, it's decline. As opposed to, wait a minute, this guy's had a job for the last 2 years, same place, same income level. That company's doing well. I can tell you that company's doing well because 1,000 other factors that we have access to. You know what? He's actually not a credit risk, right? Like that's actually someone we want to get behind, as opposed to decline because we can't figure out when we went to high school. Who cares?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because so where do you think we're going now, since you're all into the artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency and all of that? What does life look like 10 years from now?
I'm glad you said 10 years as opposed to next year.
It's anybody's guess, 2021, right?
I'll obviously be happy to make it 2021, right? No, in all seriousness, I think from a financial services perspective, I think it really does come down to just hyper personalization, but not in like a creepy way where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, no, this is too sci-fi-ish, like 1980s, the sci-fi movie-ish. I don't want that, right? But what customers do want, and to be fair, it's also a little bit generational, right? So the kids sound old now. The kids who are growing up right now, they have a certain expectation about what an experience looks like versus someone, let's say my parents' age, who are like, wait, no, I want to actually just get type in my name. I don't want them to know it was me to just walk in the door, right? And it's slightly generational, but I would say to answer your direct question, 10 years from now, it really is all about hyper personalization. It is about understanding not only that it's Scott, but it's Scott on a Friday afternoon, someone dressed down. And right now I can tell you, I can extrapolate that Scott's sort of quasi-business Scott, but he's sort of sliding into the weekend. So his persona is it shifted. The things that Scott will expect to have as he walks into a restaurant or walks into a grocery store will be dramatically different than if he was Tuesday afternoon, full suit in New York City, walking down the street. Yeah, it's still Scott, but hey, I'm going to influence Scott to maybe purchase this item. Or you know what? Don't bother Scott at all because very clearly he has a serious look on his face, carrying his briefcase, and he said it's a customer meeting. And so again, for me, it is about total hyper personalization. It's about understanding exactly what persona that actor is exhibiting at that moment in time, what persona we expect that person to exhibit in a window of time, and then ultimately how do you best create an environment that is friction free and also very secure, that again creates that hyper personalized experience such that that consumer wants to use your product, or that consumer wants to be part of your community. I mean, it's not totally geek out on you, but like that's what's coming, and frankly, that's what's already here.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting because I'm maybe dating myself now, but I still remember the Jetsons when I was growing up. And that's what it feels like. We're kind of moving into the Jetsons, which, is pretty old when you think about what they were envisioning way back then. So very interesting stuff.
Well, I'd say what's funny though about because I used to watch the Jetsons and all that stuff too, is that if you really sort of dissect those shows, like a lot of that stuff's already happened.
Yeah.
Right? So whether it be the scooters that try to knock me over in the middle of Oakland half the time, or down in here in DC, that's real, right? Whether it be all the sensor technology that enables things like the Segway devices to work, or whether it be even our online experiences where, lo and behold, I'm talking to you via video camera and real time feed, and it's almost like you're in the same room with me. That was all. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know when I was growing up in the late 70s and the 80s, that was all sci-fi stuff. Like that wasn't going to happen, and that's here now. And so the ability to even all the way down to using a mobile device and be able to unlock it with your face, or your fingerprints, or to be able to transact, i.e., send some form of currency halfway around the world, and as you know, Visa, less than a second. Like that's amazing.
Right?
And that's already here right now.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. So I'm going to kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent because I know now that you lead a company, Deep Labs, there has to be lots of discussion on representation and diversity and and I know you have somebody that's dedicated to, I think they call it people and culture, if I remember her title properly. And, I have been at places where people say, I don't want to talk about company culture. We don't have a corporate culture. What does that mean? Now we have this whole segment of people that are focused on diversity and inclusion. And I think probably every practitioner would agree that ideally those jobs should go away at some point because really we should have diversity and inclusion, belonging, equity, all embedded into all of the company activities. So are there things, especially in your business, I imagine, with representation being challenging for STEM students, like what are some things that you guys are thinking about in terms of, accessing talent in those areas?
Yeah, great question. As you know, well, that's a topic I'm quite passionate about and fully believe in. So I would say, my mindset, to be fair, is also very much given the fact that both my parents were children of the '60s, growing up in the South, and again, my grandparents, both sides, were educators. So again, education is very important. It's the building blocks of how you sort of get ahead, so to speak, right, to actually achieve the quote unquote American dream. And so with that as a backdrop, my father worked at HBCUs for most of his career. And so again, understanding how HBCUs work, understanding how the network effect associated with that, something we, whether it be when I was at Booz or at Visa, and certainly now we do tap into from a pipeline perspective. The good news is there's plenty of folks out there who are, super motivated, highly intelligent, and they just want an opportunity, right? The difficult part is figuring out how to map those folks who have all those attributes that you want into roles that, and frankly, also locations where there are communities of people of color, right? And so for us at Deep Labs, the cool thing, I was going to plug my company for a second. Sorry, I have to do it. Is that we have locations, whether it be in the Bay Area or in places like New York and Washington, D.C., which, as you know, have large communities of people of color. And so we are actively seeking folks who want to join a company that is very much forward-looking, forward-thinking, but also very much mindful of very clear core values around things like accountability, which is important, but collaboration and integrity, and having high degree of teamwork. And I stress that because at the end of the day, from a pipeline perspective, especially within the STEM perspective, most folks who come up with those programs, they've had to abide by those core values just to make it, right? You have to be accountable not only to yourself, but to other classmates. You have to have integrity of your work. Obviously, you're not going to get your diploma if you're not being honest. You have to be able to show teamwork and collaboration, because oftentimes you're dealing with group projects and everything else, right? And so for us, again, really having a dedicated function within our company focused on diversity and inclusion and people and culture is, we believe, as a fundamental enabler to the success of our business. And I would say, having spoken with other people of color that either have co-founded or founded other companies or senior executives at Fortune 100 companies, that is something that I believe is sort of universally shared at this point. I will say that, unfortunately for us, due much like everyone else in the pandemic, it has hurt a little bit our ability to recruit, if for no other reason, just getting in front of people. But I would say that for those who are listening that are actually seeking positions, there are people like me who are actually looking for people like you.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think, because even during the pandemic, I think people thought that, there's no jobs out there. And I kept trying to send them out because, every other day somebody would say they're hiring, even through the pandemic. So I think it's interesting to see how growth occurs, because clearly there's some contraction going on, but then in other areas there is still lots of growth happening. And I know we've seen lots of,
digitization growth over the last, several months. So it'll be interesting to see how things develop. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in 10 years, flying a self-driving car somewhere. Or maybe back in defense somewhere. Who knows?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being with me today. And it's always a pleasure catching up with you, Dr. Edington. And I know you do a lot of teaching. I know that's near and dear to your heart as well. So I appreciate you bringing up historically Black colleges and universities, because a lot of the HBCUs don't get the credibility, the visibility that they really deserve. So kudos to your parents and your grandparents for putting so much into you that you can continue to feed it into other generations.
I appreciate that. And I will definitely pass it along to them. They'll be pleased to hear that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here, Scott. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Melyssa. Take care.
Thanks for joining me on the Jali podcast. Please subscribe so you won't miss an episode. See you next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.